So hi, hello, and welcome. For those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Sara Hassan. I'm a writer, I'm a trainer and educator. I've been working on gender-based violence, harassment, and power abuse for the last 10 years now, and published a book with the title It's Not That Gray on how to recognize early instances of power abuse using an early recognition system. I'm very excited to talk today about some of these implications as well. I'm part of the GenderSAFE project as a facilitator and coordinator of the community of practice within the project. And in this role, it's a great pleasure to have you all here today for our webinar on overlooked challenges, strategies in reporting intersectional cases of gender-based violence. This webinar is organized within the EU-funded GenderSAFE project that promotes zero tolerance for gender-based violence in the European research area and supports research and higher education institutions in establishing safe, inclusive, and respectful environments by setting up comprehensive policies. Before we dive into today's input, let me briefly introduce today's program to you and give you a couple of notes. In today's session, we're going to talk about the issue of intersectional cases of gender-based violence, its presence in academia, and the ways in which these cases are overlooked in current reporting systems. We'll hear about the prevalence of the issue, how exactly these cases are often invisible, and how the lack of recognition relates to underreporting, and also what practical strategies can improve reporting systems so that they're more inclusive and account for cases of gender-based violence that intersect with other forms of discrimination. The first part of this webinar will be a presentation of findings where we will learn about Dr. Bontu Lucie Guschke's practice and research. Hi, Bontu. Following that input, we will have a conversation between the two of us on what is necessary to design reporting processes that are reflecting different forms of discrimination and recognize these early instances of gender-based violence in all its forms. And following that conversation, we will have a Q&A where we will get to hear questions from everyone in the audience. Please feel free to already post your questions in the chat during our conversation, and we will be happy to ask them later on. One very last note on housekeeping rules before we kick it off. Something that's always worked very well in our community of practice, something that we've been building, is a respectful space where everyone gets to be heard, where we cultivate exchange and mutual learning, where people value each other's contributions, and we want to have the same culture also here today. Disrespectful questions of any case will definitely not be platformed, and if people are not following these rules of engagement for these collective learning space that we have, we will have to ask them to take a step back. If in the worst case, anyone should repeatedly ignore these rules, we will unfortunately have to remove them. I do not think that this will be the case or necessary today, just to make sure that we're all on the same page about our rules. And now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our great speaker today. Dr. Bontu Lucie Guschke, hi Bontu again, is a consultant, a researcher, facilitator, and speaker on diversity and anti-discrimination. She got her PhD at Copenhagen Business School, researching the persistence of sexism and racism across all Danish universities. Her research has been published in international peer-reviewed journals, and she's also an editor for Femina Politica and Women, Gender, and Research. As a consultant, facilitator, and speaker, Bontu works with organizations to develop diverse and inclusive work environments. And with that, I want to give you the stage. Bontu, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you again for having me, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I'm looking forward to presenting some of my research and also practical insights and experience to you, and then most importantly, of course, to discuss with you, Sarah, and then also with everyone here. Let me start by sharing my slides, which you should be seeing now. I see some nods. Perfect. Yeah, and then I would say I'll jump right in. As introduced, what I want to talk about today are challenges and strategies in reporting intersectional cases of gender-based violence. Usually, when I talk about this topic, I would start with this overall question of why do we really still need to talk about this? I would bring in some general numbers, probably featuring the UNICEF study that I'm sure all of you are aware of, and the numbers on gender-based violence we have here. I'm not going to walk you through all of this because I'm working based on the assumption that everyone here in the room knows this, and we're kind of starting from the same page to some degree. I do, however, want to mention two important points. And the first is that there are specific groups who, because of intersectional forms of discrimination, are at an even higher risk of experiencing gender-based violence. This is something that the UNICEF study also showed. That is, for example, LGBTQ plus people with 86% compared to the 62% average. People who are non-binary at 74.1%, so really very high number. Also, people who reported disability or chronic illness are at 72%, and those belonging to an ethnic minority group at 69%. So we really see the numbers are quite a bit higher here. And the second one I want to mention is that, as you probably all know, the reporting numbers are generally low. We also see that among those groups that I just mentioned, so people who experience gender-based violence in intersection with other forms of discrimination, reporting numbers are even lower. So we have this additional layer of difficulties that people seem to experience when they experience discrimination at the intersection of, for example, gender-based violence and racism, ableism, anti-queerness, etc. And as the numbers show, we commonly overlook those when we think about reporting structures, or at least the reporting structures seem to not work so well. That would be our focus for today. The first question I want to start with is how come that this is so often overlooked? And I want to highlight two specific issues here, namely the imperceptibility of harassment and discrimination experiences and the unspeakability, especially of intersectional forms of discrimination. And I promise that I'll explain these terms in more detail. Let's start with the imperceptibility. One important aspect of why it is so hard to speak about gender-based violence, and especially intersectional forms of harassment and violence, lies in the problem of imperceptibility of harassment experiences. Imperceptibility is a term that I take from a philosopher, the philosopher François Julian, who writes about changes and how changes can be sometimes imperceptible. So meaning they're not necessarily invisible as we often kind of talk about it, but they're silent yet detrimental. And what he writes is, it can be silent, it operates without warning, without giving an alert, without attracting attention, as though independently of us, without wanting to disturb us. In silence, even when it continues on its way within us until it destroys us. And this feeling of a silent transformation on the inside that only becomes noticeable when it has already destroyed you actually outlines very accurately what many of the people that I worked with and spoke with in my research described as the experience of violence and harassment. And the thing is that we often think of gender-based violence cases, harassment cases, as this one big instance. It will be very clearly identifiable. But the way that harassment actually works is that it often starts with very quote unquote small instances, with small boundary transgressions in the everyday that are hardly noticeable. And many people that I interviewed describe that they could, for example, feel it in their bodies quite early. They could feel something is off, something is wrong. They would maybe feel dizzy or sick or anxious about coming to work, but somehow it was not severe enough and it felt too early to do anything. These instances would continue, they would get more and more severe. But at that point, the victims or targets would usually be quite caught up in this harassment relationship with the perpetrator, and they would be quite vulnerable in the sense of contextual, situational vulnerability. And it was at that point really difficult to actually see the bigger picture. And as one person said in an interview, to put all the puzzle pieces together. So at this point, it would usually need someone who says, hey, what's happening here, what this person is doing is not okay. And if you want to do something, I will support you as a first step to get out of the situation. So I'm not speaking about any kind of discourse of the vulnerable victim has to be rescued or anything like that. Not at all. But it's about acknowledging that it's a situation in which you are contextually vulnerable, in which it is hard to enact your autonomy, to resist, and it is very important to be supported. However, the problem is that at this point, most people or many people unfortunately felt that it's too late to speak up. Because why haven't I said anything earlier? Why haven't I noticed earlier? Who will believe me if I speak up now? So it's exactly because of the imperceptibility of harassment that it silently, unnoticedly destroys you. And destroy, with that I mean both in an embodied way that people really start feeling really bad, but also in the sense of destroying, more metaphorically, your autonomy. So where it becomes really hard to act autonomously and especially alone on this issue, and where therefore there really is no right point to, as we so often say, or as it is so often said, just speak up about harassment and violence, because it always feels either too early or too late. So as a very first point, it's really important to understand that the way that harassment experience and violent experiences happen is not usually this one big outrageous thing that is really easy to identify, but it works through constant pushing of what is okay and what is not, a constant slight transgression and extension of boundaries, a continuous process of different things, and we're not always so good at recognizing these at first, rather than a one-off instance. The second layer that lies on top of this, and why it is so difficult to address especially intersectional cases of gender-based violence, lies in what I call the unspeakability of intersectional discrimination. What do I mean by that? Basically, unspeakability around issues of inequality and discrimination means that it is somehow extremely uncomfortable to talk about these issues, or even more precisely, that it seems almost socially sanctioned to speak up about certain forms of discrimination. What does that look like? I'm sure we would probably all agree, or most of us would agree, that if something discriminatory and inappropriate happens, let's say in your team or something, you notice a racist incident, you should speak up. At the same time, I'm sure that we also know that situation where someone says something, someone calls something out as racist or as homophobic or as discriminatory, and it gets super tense. It's just not a comfortable thing to do. And the reasons for that are several. One is that people feel very attacked when their behavior is called out as excluding or discriminatory. And interestingly, this is especially often people who feel like they're already working towards equality and inclusion, but maybe have overlooked an intersectional dimension, but it becomes very uncomfortable to acknowledge that. Building on that, the second point why that is so hard is because there's this fear of not knowing what to do about it if we were to acknowledge that this was indeed racist, homophobic, etc., because then we would have to act. And often we simply don't know how to act because the solutions, the ideas we have built do not address maybe the specific problem that we have at hand. And the problem for which we don't have a solution yet becomes this looming thing in the room. We know it's there, we know we should address it, but we actually do not know how. And it gets so uncomfortable that we try to avoid it at all costs. Wherefore, if someone then points an issue out, we often quite intuitively react with rejecting their statement, maybe not believing this person, seeing them as troublemakers, as making a fuss, anything to avoid this discomfort of having to deal with a problem for which we do not have good solutions. And the thing is, if discrimination and inequalities are unspeakable, not only do we not speak about them, but by not speaking about them, the problem is reproduced unnoticed and it becomes normalized within the higher education context. Because only if we give words to a problem can we start solving it. And while this can theoretically be the case for all forms of discrimination, what we see in higher education specifically is that we have become somewhat more comfortable to speak about sexism and gender-based violence. But most of us, many of us, are still extremely uncomfortable speaking about intersectional forms of discrimination, especially about any intersections with racism, where, for example, racist forms of discrimination often remain unspeakable, even within diversity and anti-discrimination work. So we kind of learned to speak about gender-based violence. We're certainly not there yet. We still have a lot to do there as well. But especially with intersectional cases of violence and discrimination, they often remain unspeakable, normalized, and overlooked, even within our own settings in which we're trying to work on getting better and addressing more violence. That's just as a rough overview of the problem that we're currently facing and how it is reproduced. And an additional barrier, and this is what will be the main focus for today, is that most reporting systems are set up in such a way that they also, so to speak, overlook these cases because they're set up in a way that doesn't think about these intersectional cases and doesn't think about how discrimination might happen here. What I want to share with you, therefore, are four main challenges in institutional reporting systems that are part of the reason why these systems fail intersectional cases of gender-based violence quite often. And we'll try to look at them kind of along the reporting process, which on purpose is not a straight line because it hardly ever is. The first and maybe most fundamental one that I want to mention here is that there's quite often a misunderstanding about what intersectionality actually is. I know that intersectionality has become quite a buzzword. Last year, I was part of doing an analysis of EU higher education policies, where we examined how the term intersectionality is used. And even there, it appears quite frequently, but, and that also became clear, quite often without a real understanding of what it actually means. Therefore, I think it's important to briefly address it. What happens, not only in these policies, but also in the reporting system, is that intersectionality is sometimes equated with multiple discrimination. So, and that's not entirely correct, because multiple discrimination implies that we have different forms of discrimination and we can just add them together. So first we look at sexism and gender-based violence, then we look separately at racism, then perhaps at disability and ableism, at LGBTQIA plus topics, etc. And if we add all these up, then we supposedly cover multiple forms of discrimination. However, that's not really how it works. Because on the one hand side, such an approach leads to thinking in silos, and I'm going to say a bit more about that later. And on the other hand, it leads to the continuous overlooking of certain positions, namely exactly those where those forms of discrimination intersect or overlap. So if I just take myself as an example, as a queer Black woman, if I work in the university system, I may experience what we may call anti-queer racialized sexism in different forms. And if there's a reporting office at my university for sexism that is primarily oriented towards the concerns of white women and has no real expertise on racism, and then there's maybe an anti-racism office, but they're not really queer inclusive, then my specific experience of discrimination somehow falls through the cracks and I wouldn't really know who to turn to. So what we would need instead is an anti-discrimination approach that really considers how gender-based discrimination affects, for example, women of color, queer women. And, I took myself as an example. Of course, it goes beyond that. For example, also the experiences of women with Disabilities, thinking about accessible reporting structures, major problem in many places. Thinking about non-binary people, people with chronic illnesses. Also here, if we think about gender inclusive or impairment sensitive reporting procedures, often unfortunately not available. And this is really important because if we remember the first slide and just a few numbers that I gave you, these are exactly the groups in higher education that are most affected by discrimination, but they're usually considered the least in how we set up reporting structures. So what intersectionality should be about here is about understanding and accounting for context-relevant interconnections of discrimination. Probably not all of them at once, but the ones that matter in a given context, and providing support and reporting options for these intersectional cases of violence and discrimination, which unfortunately often is not the case. And I'll say a bit more later about how that could maybe be done differently and better in practice. But as a first challenge, intersectional cases of gender-based violence need to have there needs to be an access point or need to be thought about as part of the reporting system. There needs to be access points for people who experience gender-based violence in intersection with other forms of discrimination. One solution that is then sometimes offered for different reasons for those who don't feel like they can so easily access the existing reporting structures and realize, maybe it doesn't work so well, is that there is an option for anonymous reporting. And that brings me to my second point. Anonymous reporting can be very useful and it can be very important because it provides the option to kind of inform the institution without having to provide my own name. And that can be something like a whistleblower system, where then quite often these anonymous reports are rather used to find out about patterns of violence and discrimination. For example, we have several anonymous accounts of gender-based violence at a specific department, then maybe this department is being required to do some general awareness raising trainings for the whole department staff. So usually, as far as I know, it often won't lead to individual sanctions, but it provides insights about organizational level problems, and it might trigger group-wide measures. Now, what is often argued is that this is particularly helpful for vulnerable groups who fear negative consequences if they were to file a named report. And yes, that is to some extent true. However, the challenge that is often overlooked here is that in a grossly unequal organization, full anonymity may simply not be possible for marginalized groups. So for example, if I'm the only Black person at my department and I anonymously report an instance of racism, and then this leads to the department doing an anti-racism training, or I'm the only person in a wheelchair and I anonymously report ableist discrimination, people will quite likely know who reported this, even if it is officially anonymous. So even when anonymous reporting options are provided, it's really important to think about how are they embedded in the structures of a workplace and to consider for which people or which groups of people anonymity might still not be an option. And then what do we do in these cases? And in these cases, it might be quite important that you can, for example, file some kind of a named report or come in as a named person, but still ask for full confidentiality and ask for, being allowed to speak with a person and be informed about what are the different options, what roads can I take, what consequences might this have, before you decide what options you want to choose, rather than just saying, oh, well, we'll have an anonymous reporting system and this is what people can access. This also matters because in many organizations, as I mentioned briefly, a real full investigation of a case is usually only possible if the report is named. So if it's not anonymous, because only then is there a full chance for a transparent investigation into what happened and sanctions against the individual person. And this links to the second part that links to anonymity here, which is transparency. On the one hand side, if we look at the side of the target or the victim, it's extremely important that this person who then maybe decides to report is transparently informed about what does this reporting process entail, who will be involved in it, that they're continuously updated on how this case might be moving forward, because it's extremely disorienting and anxiety provoking if you report something and then you have no idea what actually follows, who might hear from this, who may contact you about it, what may you be asked to do, etc. So it's essential to ensure transparency toward them. At the same time, it's important that a person who's accused has a certain transparency on what they're accused of and what the process will look like for them. So will they be able to share their perspective, for example? Will they be informed of who reported them, so that they know which situations are being discussed or not? Because this might stand in opposition to the reporting person's need or wish for anonymity. And the reason why it's important for me to stress this potential tension here between like the need for anonymity on the one hand side, but also the reported person's need for transparency, is because from an intersectional perspective, there's kind of an additional complication here, because what we also have to think about are biased assessments against certain groups of potential perpetrators. So as an obvious, or maybe obvious example, but as one example, Black men and men of color are usually treated more harshly than white men when they are accused of harassment and discrimination and of violence. We also know that women who are accused of discrimination or violence, for example, a white woman being accused of racist discrimination against a colleague of color, tend to be treated more nicely and not as harshly. So also here, an intersectional understanding of the power dynamics between the different people who can be in different roles in the scenario is really important, and a clear process in terms of transparency and procedures is even more important to avoid unequal treatment, where in some cases a person gets a lot of transparency, in other cases this person is kind of left in the dark. So I'm not saying anonymous reporting yes or no, or per se good or bad. I'm just saying from an intersectional perspective, these aspects of anonymity and also transparency are often more difficult than it might seem at first sight. Third problem that we have is that people who do not report let's call it a classic case of gender-based violence, commonly run into problems of around the burden of proof. This is a general problem in reporting any kind of gender-based violence, but especially so in intersectional cases. The general or overall challenge that we have here is that we need some kind of guiding rules as to what counts as violence, as harassment, as discrimination, and can thus be handled in the reporting process. And we have a variety of difficulties that emerge from this. If we especially continue what I was just talking about, the imperceptibility and the unspeakability of violence and discrimination, because if we acknowledge that harassment, gender-based violence, discrimination can happen, first of all, in many different ways, it often happens in ways that are normalized, that are not immediately recognizable. It means that we cannot just have a schema that will always make it easy for us to say, yes, this is a case of gender-based violence. No, this is not one. But usually we need to really do it on a case-by-case basis. And we need to have people who, as part of this process, then assess, is what happened here a case of gender-based violence, of intersectional discrimination or not? And also, do we find it credible and plausible that it actually happened in this way? So do we have sufficient proof? And the first question that this raises is, of course, who holds the responsibility to provide this proof, to make an assessment of what counts as proof, and to gathering any information that might be needed here. And because usually, or in many cases, there is no material proof, it comes down to the reporting person's credibility. So you have a person who reports, and it's often about whether or not what they're telling is or seems believable, credible. And this is where intersectionality again comes in two specific ways. First, we know that people who are not only marginalized in a gendered way, but also affected by intersectional forms of discrimination are less likely to be seen as credible. We know that already for women, so we know that women in general are already implicitly seen as less credible than men. Black women, for example, experience even higher rates of not being trusted and believed. So your chances to be seen as providing a credible, plausible account of the violence and discrimination you experienced is already lower if you find yourself intersectionally marginalized. And the second and related problem is that the way that violence and discrimination is commonly recognized is if it looks similar to the common narratives that we know. So if a white cisgender woman tells a story of being physically, sexually harassed by a supervisor at a conference, we have learned to recognize that script, and we're more likely to assume that it is indeed true. And that's, of course, important and good because these cases do happen and it's important that they're recognized. But when your experience of violence kind of falls outside this normative frame of what we have learned, what gender-based violence is would look like, or what we imagine it to look like, and again, here also think about how we usually do not think about it as imperceptible. But also if your experience, for example, involves racialized forms of sexism or a combination of ableism, sexism, racist anti-queerness, yeah, a lot of violence happens, for example, against trans people of color. If this is the case, then it's unfortunately more unlikely for you or for your experience to be recognized as an experience of violence and discrimination, and it's more likely that this person's credibility is questioned simply because it is easier for us to recognize and acknowledge something that we've seen or heard about or come across before. So the burden of proof becomes a significant challenge, especially in intersectional cases of discrimination, and often, unfortunately, the point where a claim is turned down as not relevant enough to be investigated or looked into further. And then fourth and finally, we have issues around emotions and affectedness. From what we talked about so far, it might seem as if a reporting process is this very kind of formalized, somewhat bureaucratic process. But the thing is, being involved in such a case is usually a very emotional situation. So the person who's reporting will be emotionally affected in different ways. They might be scared, angry, hurt, confused. And the person who is being accused will likely also react very emotionally, reacting maybe with anger, with resistance, with confusion, with insecurity. So part of the responsibility is to think about how do we deal with these emotions. And one really important thing to not do or to avoid, and I'm naming this because it happens a lot, is to take people less seriously because they're very emotional. Common pattern that we see is that people who are very emotional when they report and maybe cry or get very angry are taken less seriously and are often judged as being as kind of exaggerating. And it's something that happens unconsciously often. It is especially here that gendered biases intersect with racist, with queerphobic, with classist, and ableist stereotypes in really problematic ways, because many of the stereotypical and discriminatory tropes that we have, such as the angry Black woman or the overreacting trans person or the too sensitive gay guy, they all have this effect of not taking these people as seriously and kind of going into this thing of, oh, she's so angry, maybe she's not really in a state to assess this situation properly and I shouldn't take her too seriously. Or, you know, if he's so emotional, I think he's probably overreacting and I shouldn't take his account and his accusations too seriously right now. So one challenge here is to consider how we can train people involved in a reporting process in such a way that they can work with people who are very emotional, very, very affected, very emotionally vulnerable, and that these people are aware of how their own biases might shape their assessment of another person's emotion, because again, thinking intersectionally here, different people might express their emotional effectiveness in very different ways. And to you, it might look like someone is reacting too much, or maybe someone looks like they're not severely emotionally affected at all, or the way that they express this just looks strange to you. And you might read it as, oh, do I find this credible or not? When they might just be processing emotions in a way that is very different to how you would process it. So what we're lacking currently is what we could maybe call intersectional care, as part of understanding emotions and dealing with emotions in a more open and more conscious way. Now, I've spent quite a lot of time highlighting these problems, both in how this happens in general, and then how this looks like, or what this might look like in the reporting system. And I think that's really important because, as I said, we need to name a problem in order to solve it. Nonetheless, of course, it's also important that we think a little bit about what practical strategies for designing more inclusive, responsive reporting mechanisms from an intersectional perspective do we have? What could that look like? Therefore, let me share with you some best practice advice, or now I want to say better practice. I'm not a huge fan of the best practice term, but some practice advice that I developed based on both of my research insights, but then also my experience as an anti-discrimination consultant. So one thing that I think becomes quite clear is how reporting processes today are built upon this assumption that harassment and violence happens as this one big instance. It's clearly identifiable, easy to describe. You describe it, you write it down, you report it, you process it. But that's hardly ever the case because, as I showed, it happens in imperceptible ways that often makes it very hard to even recognize what's going on, to just speak up, and not to speak up, just report. So what we need are, more broadly speaking, I think, support structures that do not necessarily require individuals to be the only ones to carry that burden of identifying, naming, speaking up. And I think we need several things to do that. What we need, first of all, are better support structures for bystanders and allies, for example, bystander trainings, which means teaching everyone in the organization what to do when they realize or suspect that someone is experiencing violence and how they can support that person in speaking up and seeking help. As I said, one of the main things that the people I spoke with were saying is how you really need support in that kind of process. You need someone to help you put these puzzle pieces together to show you that you're trusted, that you're believed, that you're not alone. And way too often, especially in higher education contexts, people who witness something either don't know how to act or don't want to get involved because they're afraid that it will have negative consequences for them. They kind of don't want to get into the math and rather, unfortunately, leave people alone with this experience. And part of this is that no matter how uncomfortable it seems, we really need to get better at recognizing and acknowledging all forms of discrimination and listening to those who try to speak up about their experiences. Also, and maybe especially if that does not affect ourselves, because if we acknowledge discrimination as intersectionally, we realize that it's not like some of us are always on the side of experiencing discrimination and others never, but it's rather really that at different times and in different contexts, we might either need support because we are affected ourselves, or we might be in a position to support someone else as an ally. So it's really about thinking contextually about what is my position within the system and how can we train each other and people on how to react differently. But next to this, of course, we need more formal reporting and support mechanisms that don't wait for things to escalate before they seem accessible. So this moment where people realize something is off, but they cannot quite place it. So it seems kind of too early to do something, too small to do something. Already at that point, we need a way for them to share their concerns. And this might not be a formal reporting process at this point, because not in all cases does it require formal reporting at this point, but it needs some kind of way to record and support record what's going on and support this person. So this possibility to share, to realize what's going on, to monitor how it develops, and to be supported and potentially protected, and to assess, is this something to worry about or not? So what we need in practice is kind of two different units, one for reporting and one for support. And I want to say a couple of words before I come to the end about these two. Starting with the reporting one. We need in research organizations units that are responsible for and trained in handling the reporting process. And this unit needs to be responsible for a couple of things. It needs to provide, first of all, easily accessible ways for people to report an incident of gender-based violence and intersectional discrimination. And easily accessible here means, for example, having a personalized access point, so named person who you can contact. And it also means providing sufficient and easy information on who this person is and how to reach that contact point. So when I do policy reviews, for example, and process consultancies for universities and research organizations, part of what I do in the beginning is that I usually test how easy it is to find out about the support structures that exist. And unfortunately, more often than not, the online infrastructure that is supposed to help targets and victims is often so complicated and so hard to access that it makes things worse rather than better, or definitely not necessarily easier. And this is especially the case when intersectionality is misunderstood as multiple discrimination. Because what then happens often is that instead of having one clear first access point, the organization names a whole bundle of different ones. There's maybe one for sexual harassment, one for racist discrimination, one for disability and inclusion matters. And while the intention is very understandable because you want to cover many forms of discrimination, you want to provide different options for different people, this can also make it extremely hard to navigate for someone who is in this moment of experiencing potentially an intersectional form of violence and discrimination, and suddenly you have this burden of having to identify, but in which discrimination box do I fit in? And that shouldn't be on that person. So instead, my recommendation would always be that there should be one easily accessible access point, which is the starting point. And from there, people can be provided, of course, with different available options of who they can turn to. But quite often, unfortunately, it creates this huge mess of a million different access points, and in the end, no one really knows where to go. The second then related really important point is that the people who then work within this reporting system, of course, need to have sufficient expertise on gender-based violence, on intersectional discrimination, on power abuse, on how this happens. Again, often a huge problem or a huge issue that happens is that someone suddenly has the responsibility of being the access point for gender-based violence, maybe even for intersectional discrimination, but they get zero support, zero training on what that means, how it is reproduced, how you best support people, how you practice intersectional care, all of these things. Quite often that is also because it happens in such a way that historically speaking, we often maybe already have a gender equality office in place. And suddenly that office gets the mandate to provide all of these support structures and reporting possibilities for all kinds of violence and discrimination, but again, without any training and understanding intersectional forms of discrimination, without sufficient knowledge on how to do this. And one advice maybe of how this can be handled practically, how this can be handled differently in practice, is to have differently trained caseworkers, or however we want to call them. So have maybe have a person who is particularly with a particular expertise on sexism and sexualized violence, someone who has particular expertise on racism and racist discrimination, on ableist discrimination and disableism, on anti-queerness, etc. But instead of having then different units, so this is what I mentioned earlier with the siloing, where then it is expected of the affected person to choose, oh, who of these do I now contact, to have them work as a cross-expert team. So when a person comes in and reports, the first expert, the first person they speak to assesses, okay, what might be going on here? What forms of discrimination might be relevant here? And then they come together with different people in the team who bring this expertise about different intersections of discrimination. And it becomes an intersectional assessment of the case and not kind of the siloed approach based on the premise that there's multiple discrimination. Now we have to find out which of those it was. The third point here that, of course, this unit needs to inform about anonymity and transparency, because as I said, this can be kind of a challenge and a tension, and it is very, very important that people are informed. What are my options? Is there full anonymity? Is there confidentiality? To what degree, etc. And that this unit works out what are possible and appropriate sanctions. And this is a very context-specific question. There is no one-size-fits-all answers. I won't go into too much more detail here. I'm happy to talk about it more in the discussion if relevant. But what is important is that this needs to be discussed beforehand and not when the first case comes in and suddenly no one actually knows what possible sanctions are, which is something that I have experienced. This is the reporting part. And again, also happy to discuss it further. Next to this, what we need are people who are responsible for and trained in providing support. So being a trustworthy contact point where an affected person can turn to maybe record their experiences, to be heard, to be listened to be taken seriously. And what is really important again here is that these people understand how violence and discrimination can happen intersectionally, because especially here, it is your task to help the affected person what is going on. So you need someone who not only knows the classic scripts, the normative scripts of what it looks like, but a person who might know and understand what gender-based violence looks like for a woman of color, for a non-binary person, for a woman with a disability. And linking back also to the point about emotions, this would also be a person or a team who understands and is trained in how to handle extremely emotionally challenging and vulnerable situations, and to create, as I was saying, these practices of intersectional care. So really thinking about how can we support a diverse group of people who might need different support throughout the process. My recommendation is usually to keep these two access points separate, one for support and one for reporting. So not necessarily have that be the same person or the same team, because it simply requires a different process and different perspective if your task is to provide support and protection, or if it is about reporting and potentially sanctioning someone. Both of them are important and necessary, but they have a different focus, and it unfortunately often gets quite messy when they're tried to be put into the same person or same team. I think I'll leave it at that, because I think if we manage to work through all that, better bystander structures, better reporting structures, better support units, then we already have achieved quite a lot. So I'll stop here, and I look very much forward to the discussion.
Wow, thank you so much, Bontu. This was incredibly instructive and informative. I have taken so many notes, and I'm sure others have also. I think this was really an incredible journey from the imperceptibility and unspeakability of these instances to the normative or classic cases and narratives that I think are incredibly important, but also the context relevant interconnections, and maybe some misperceptions of intersectionality. So I have a million questions, and I'm sure everybody else in the room does too. I would like to start with this dilemma that you have presented us with this issue of either reporting too early or too late, where people who are affected do indeed feel that something is off quite early on, but it feels like it is not an instance that could be reported. Often language is lacking for that. And then, like you presented so powerfully, things have to escalate until it feels like things are indeed too late. So when we are developing reporting processes, when we're creating interview designs, what do we need to take into account to try and solve this dilemma? And also thinking about early recognition systems that can be implemented both on the prevention and the reporting side of things. And I would love to hear from you about that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Um, a couple of different steps, I think, kind of along the way of the spectrum of what is part of dealing with violence and discrimination experiences. So I think the very first point is that as part of the prevention work, we need to get better at creating awareness broadly around how does harassment and discrimination happen, and that um, a lot of the people that I spoke with said, I just didn't expect it to happen like this. I thought it would be more directly violent or more easy also for myself to recognize. So I think a lot of awareness around, hey, like this often happens in this imperceptible way, in this way where at first there might be certain warning signs that you can maybe learn to recognize, but that you might not automatically in the moment realize that this is what is happening here. And the same kind of sensibility then on the side of the support structures and the reporting process. So one thing that matters here, and we know this from survey research also, is that if we ask people, have you experienced gender-based violence? The number is really low. And if we then go into the details of the specific things that can be part of that, that the number is a lot higher because people might not give the name gender-based violence or discrimination to what is happening to them. But if we ask specifically about instances of that, it's easier for people to relate their own experience to what we're calling it or we're naming it. So this is also something that is really important in what you call like an interview guide or like a way of how we speak with people about their potential experiences, that we create more of an openness to understand what their experience is. Another part of that, and that is often difficult, is what I was saying about how many people said at first they could feel it in a very embodied way. So they would feel tense, just feel like when I'm in a room with this person, I just start sweating immediately. And this is, of course, tricky because it's not a, oh, if you start sweating and if your neck gets tense, then of course that is always a sign of harassment discrimination, but it's one of these ways in which I think we often hold quite a lot of embodied knowledge of something is off here. And this is what I mean with this support structure that is maybe not yet part of a formal reporting system, but where there's a person who can help you understand what are the different puzzle pieces. And in some cases, this might not end up as a puzzle of, oh, we have a case of gender-based violence, but in some cases it might. And then it's really important that we have those early puzzle pieces in case. And one thing that I think is then something interesting to think about is what is the relation between the support unit where you maybe do this early recording of early warning signs and the later reporting process. Because as I said, when you get to the reporting, many people feel like, oh, now it's too late. Why didn't I say anything earlier? I don't even remember all the steps of what happened in the beginning, and now suddenly I'm here. So this support unit on the one hand side is really important that it is, as I said, decoupled from the reporting, because it needs to be somewhat of a confidential safe space where a person can go to even if they don't know yet if they want to report. On the other hand, it could be very useful if there is a way to record already these early warning signs. And if this person decides to report later on, to already have that as a basis for this is what has been happening all along. If again, always if the person wants that, if the person wants to report, etc., so that we can kind of put these things together. Because often if we look at them individually, at just one of them individually, it doesn't look so bad, or it's not as easily identifiable. But if they're put together, we have a whole picture of different steps along this way of power abuse, discrimination, etc.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's also something that really needs to be taken into account. How, for example, action-based questions, whether have you ever avoided a certain situation or a certain person in order to not experience further discrimination, can bring up different answers than when you ask very broadly and maybe on a more theoretical level. This brings me to the next question, where I think we are very much in this field where we are trying to find a comprehensive definition for gender-based violence that does indeed reflect all of these instances. And we're also working with a zero tolerance policy. And so I would like to ask you, drawing from your research on this imperceptibility of racism, of sexism, of different forms of intersectional violence and how they come together. How can we include them so that they are not, like you explained, additive or an afterthought? How can they really inform intersectionally policy formulations and definitions? Do you have a suggestion for us here?
Yeah, so I mentioned the study that we did last year where we looked at EU policies on the EU level and looking at how they use the term intersectionality. And there it was often very obvious that it was more of an empty signifier. So we use the term intersectionality because somehow that has become relevant, but the policy text and the measures stay the same. And the way what then happens is that it becomes kind of a gender equality plus approach where we do all the things we have been doing about gender equality and against gender-based violence. And then we always have like a sentence in the end that says, and of course, we need to look at this intersectionally as well, or of course, other forms of discrimination play a role as well. And that's not enough. That's not going to help us. So I think going back to the point of looking at context-specific relevant intersections, we need to get much better at asking ourselves, what are the lines of power, the axes of power that we have in the higher education context, and which forms of discrimination are relevant here. And we do know quite a lot about that. We know about the racism that happens at universities. We know about, for example, gender-based violence that women with disabilities face and the specificities of that. So I think also in the way that we then formulate this policy, we need to make that explicit and not say gender-based violence, which involves these 6 points, plus intersectional forms of that, but really being more specific. And of course, we will never have a whole comprehensive list of anything that could happen. But being more in our own analysis of the situation and in how we then communicate this to people who might be affected, more precise, and which intersections are we talking about here and naming them. And avoiding, as I said, this additive approach of just saying these are the different forms, and then somehow we think they play together, but we don't really know how. And in some cases, as I said, I think we have some of these analysis on a broad level, and some we need to do that on a context-specific level. But it's really important because otherwise, intersectionality, and this links to the point of unspeakability, intersectionality almost becomes part of the problem of unspeakability, because instead of actually naming the specific problems, we use this nice term intersectionality. It becomes an empty signifier, and everyone feels good about the work done, but nothing in the content has really changed. This relates also, you just mentioned it briefly, that, you know, working with a zero tolerance approach, that that is often, again, one of these terms that is used to say, we will take everything that happens seriously and we will do something, or we will address it in one or the other way. But if you really follow that through also from an intersectional perspective, that also means that you might have cases that to you do not look like they fit into that script or that narrative of gender-based violence. And nonetheless, if, from my view, if you have a zero tolerance approach and you really want to honor that, also these cases need to be taken into account, need to be investigated, need to be looked into, and not dismissed, as it unfortunately often happens, because they do not fit this normative script of what is going on here.
Yeah, incredible. Thank you so much. This brings me to my last question before I want to open up the room for everybody. I've seen a couple of questions already in the chat, but please feel free to write more and I will be happy to pose them then. I wanted to come back to what you just mentioned, those classic cases of gender-based violence, and how cases that do not fall into this normative frame or narrative are not considered as part of the problem. And I was wondering, not just in terms of credibility of people with different intersectional experiences of discrimination, but how might it be possible to take a closer look or change these common narratives and scripts? I was also wondering about how abuse of power might play into this here, when we're thinking about how different people in different positions of power can abuse those positions no matter what their gender or color of the skin. And yeah, I was interested in looking at this narrative a little more closely, and if you have a suggestion for this.
I definitely think that it is possible to change and broaden these or verify and not verify create a broader variety of these narratives because and this is really important the reason why we have certain scripts right now that those of us working in the field do know and that are more and more being taken seriously has been a struggle and a fight that has been taken on by many people that work in this field of anti-discrimination work, feminist work, fighting against gender-based violence to make these narratives known, credible, and create credibility around them, show that this is how it happens. This is what happens in conference spaces. This is what power abuse looks like. So just to say that that we're able to recognize these narratives that we do have of what I now call maybe more classic cases, that has been a big achievement and a really important one. And I think what it also shows us that we can create and recreate and negotiate what these narratives are. And the task at hand now is to become more specific of what are other forms in which, because you mentioned that as a specific perspective, in which power is abused, in which power is misused in university contexts. And I think that always involves two sides. That is, on the one hand side, what happens. So, for example, strategies around how people are put in situations of dependency, how they're isolated among their colleagues, how the structures of the university system, such as a lot of precarity, a lot of competition, are used, especially against already marginalized groups, to make it easier to harass and discriminate and put them in a city of violence. And on the flip, or at the same time, the narratives that make it easier to hide this as a normal part of this is just how universities works, and that is narratives around denying that violence really happened, dismissing that this was really a case of violence and not just a misunderstanding, not just part of how the university system works, individualizing the cases that happen. So saying this is not a general script of something that happens, this is just you individually overreacting. So it's looking at both of these sides, what happens and how does it happen and how is it normalized and how is it made part to believe that this is just how it's supposed to be, and then kind of fighting for these narratives and these scripts to become more known so that they also become recognizable as part of gender-based violence or intersectional cases of discrimination in intersection with gender-based violence.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I will now move to the chat and see what some of our participants have already asked. One participant says, "Hi, good to hear that in theory we're doing quite well as a university. That's good news. Considering the good practices you've just explained. One big hurdle for us is that you cannot act as an institution on situations which are reported without lifting the anonymity of the people reporting. Any situation which you want to act on is immediately recognizable for all people concerned. You can only keep it anonymous if you tell someone that someone felt threatened by something you said during a meeting. Can you elaborate on how, in practice, you juggle transparency with anonymity?"
Yeah, I can. That's exactly the challenge that I was describing, and I can see that you also recognize that in your own work. And I think I don't have like the easy way out or the good solution, because that is exactly the balance to strike. That and what I was trying to explain also is that there is also to some extent good reasons for why we need this transparency within the process, because if you're on the side of being accused of something, it can also be important to be informed of what is the specific situation we're talking about. On the other hand side, it is especially because of the way that higher education works, because of dependencies, etc., often very difficult and understandable that people fear negative consequences if they report with their name. One, and this is not like the solution to this problem, but one problem that sometimes comes on top of this and that we can address is that the people who report are not sufficiently informed about the situation, because we talk about anonymity and transparency and confidentiality. And these are, and especially anonymity and confidentiality, are two different things that are often kind of put together, and especially by targeted people, not really understood what it means, that it can be that you report in a named way. So the person you are talking to, and the people who need to be involved in the case need to be informed, but will be handled confidentially in the sense that it will not be shared in the broad public. Sometimes that is misunderstood as anonymous. And then that is very violent if then suddenly that information is shared, maybe with the perpetrator, maybe with the person in leadership, when the reporting person was under the impression that it would be anonymous. So first of all, again, an access point, a support point where you can go to, where then also the person you report to does not have the responsibility or the duty to immediately act, but they can confidentially talk with you about this, inform you of the different options, and also explain to you what consequences or what steps lie ahead if this goes into a reporting process. Another thing, and this is more from the point of view of what people have tried more informally in practice, is to work with complaint collectives, so that people who maybe experience discrimination and violence from the same person or a group of people. And it's not only me, but it's also, 4 other colleagues that I know who experience the same, that they kind of come forward together as a complaint collective, as it is often called, as a bottom-up approach. And usually the reporting structures in place don't cater to that. So there's often not really a possibility to file a shared report, for example. So this could be something to think about, that again doesn't just dissolve this whole problem of anonymity and transparency, but that maybe provides a support structure to report non-anonymously, so with a named report, but not only in your own name, but as a group of people that can support each other, and where it's not so easy for the more powerful person to create negative consequences for you if you report.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I will move on to the next question in chat. Another participant says, thank you very much for this exciting presentation. I wonder what a good evaluation and investigation process might look like. What should be the criteria of such assessments? If, as you mentioned, credibility is top priority, and who should make this assessment? Thanks for suggesting.
Yes. So again, one thing that I think is really helpful here is to not, to this question of who should make this assessment, to not have any individual person to run such a process, to have a broad team, and a broad team with different expertise, especially again, thinking intersectionally, to have people who are trained across different intersections of forms of discrimination. I've seen this work in different ways, because sometimes there's maybe not, if we think really practically, the resources to have, a team of 10 people who are part of a reporting anti-discrimination office, whatever it is called. So sometimes what some universities have tried out is to work with these trust teams or trust people. So maybe you have 2 people who are kind of the main responsible, the first access point people talk to, but then you have a team of sometimes voluntary or structured in different ways, people who then get the specific training also. So again, important that these people then have the expertise on different intersectional aspects, and that they can then be called in on to make assessments about these cases. What is also important to think about here is, again, the power structures, so that of course the people deciding about this process should not be someone who is directly responsible for the reporting person. So if this shouldn't be, the head of department, who quite likely has some form of interaction relationship with several people involved in this case to take this decision. There is some instances where universities have decided to work with an external service provider, so an external unit that assesses these cases. And that can be very useful in the sense that these people then have no personal interest and involvement in the institution, and a more kind of external perspective. However, in most, or in all cases that I know of, the final decision of what is being done, what sanction is being taken, what consequence still lies with the university. So it's also sometimes this challenge between, yes, you can to some extent maybe outsource that process, and that can be a very good idea because you get an external expert eye on it. But if the decision is then again taken inside the organization, then you still need to, these people need to be trained very well on what to be taken into account. And this links a little bit to this, what should be the criteria. And I don't think that we can have like a clear list of criteria because, as I said, in the sense that a lot of these warning signs, you cannot look at one of them and say, oh, if we click, yes on 3 out of 7, then it is definitely a case. But there needs to be awareness and sensibility in the people who report this on what can be potential warning signs in different instances, and when is it likely that this has indeed taken place. And sorry, just as I know I'm talking, speaking a lot, but as a last note on that one, a lot of work also in overcoming this idea that there's a lot of cases of misreporting. So people reporting cases that didn't actually take place. Of course, there's individual cases where that happens, and that is problematic. But it's not, there's this huge myth that this is a general thing that happens a lot, that people report things that didn't happen. This reporting process is often so complicated and so difficult for a reporting person that this is usually not something that someone would go into if they don't have a good reason for doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hear and see great praise for you and your dissertation in the chat. I think we will all be reading that afterwards. And I've got another question that might be a tricky one. One participant asks, in our case, what often happens is that the institution is taken to court after the sanctions have been applied and the perpetrator was hired back. What advice do you have in these situations, if any?
Yeah, I think I'll have to skip that one to be honest, because I'm not a legal scholar, and I think especially with these questions, it's really important then to get in someone with the legal expertise to really answer that. So I don't want to give any wrong information on it. So I think I'll skip this one.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I think that makes a lot of sense to like delineate the boundaries of expertise. And with that, I would move on to the next question in the chat, which is, do you have any thoughts on the focus within reporting processes for the reporting party to name and identify their own experiences as discrimination? I work in a support unit for students who sometimes don't confidently have the language to define and articulate their experiences at the point of reporting, and this often leads to a devaluation or devaluing of their report and its severity. I support with this to the extent I can, but it can take a long time for reporting parties to fully understand and process the depth of what they experienced.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that and relate to that. So this issue that you experience something and it can really take quite a while to yourself understand what has been going on, to name it as what it is. I had people that I interviewed who were speaking about experiences that were a couple of years back, and who in through the conversation that we were having were realizing, wow, this was really more than I realized at the time, and only now looking back at it can I realize what it is. So I think exactly as this person is saying, to provide any support possible in that situation to figure that out is really important, and to take that time. Um, on the process side, that is also something to consider, like how long after an incident can you report? Sometimes these times are ridiculously short, and that is really unhelpful because it does often take quite a lot of time until you get the courage to do something. And then it takes time to maybe talk with this support person about what has really been going on here. What I think, so I'm not 100% sure what the role or the exact role of this person who was writing this question is, but let's say you're in a support victim-centered perspective, working from that perspective. I think it can also be very helpful to explain this is how the reporting system works. These are kind of the things that are being recognized as part of this, what we've been talking about, what you've been describing. could be seen as something like this and that. So it's not about defining it for them, because if they don't define it as that, that is their choice. But um, to give them this offer saying, this is what it could be. And if then it can be reported here rather than letting someone go into the reporting process unsupported. And then often people going in and saying, I feel like I just didn't have the right words to describe what is going on and they didn't understand what actually happened. So I think it can actually also be the role of that support unit to hold that balance between I listen to you, I let you describe it in your own words. I have this openness to understanding what this might be, even though you cannot name it. And if you decide to report, part of the way that I support you is to explain to you, this is the categories we have in the reporting system. This is what they can mean. And this is what you, if you want, you could name this at, because this is the categories and how they work. And that is a delicate process because it can be very difficult for a person who themselves, I had people in the interview said, but I don't think I'm a person who was harassed or anything. So also to hold that space and again have this intersectional care of dealing with the emotions that come up as part of that. But at the same time, if they want to report, to be strategic and pragmatic in explaining what is possible within the reporting system and what are things named as.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think this also relates to what you said earlier in terms of people might not be able to simply identify with a single word, such as discrimination or gender-based violence. But if it is broken down and very specific and is maybe also zeroing in on various actions and effects, that might help people to orient themselves and identify what is going on with them rather than trying to identify whether what they're experiencing lives up
Yeah,
to a certain definition. Um, that being
absolutely.
said, yeah, I see more questions in the chat, and I will try my best to make it through all of them. There is another participant who asks about the importance of bystander programs that you mentioned. Are specific programs needed, or should this be integrated into existing programs? So I think this points to where in priorities should this be positioned, and what is your suggestion about that?
Um, Or actually, I was in terms of priorities, or I think the question underneath is a bit, how do you make it a priority for people to be part of this? I think this is the question we often struggle with in practice, that we can have really great offers, and then if no one shows up, especially in a higher education system where usually we cannot force people to do anything, I think it can be very useful actually to have them as part of existing programs and to think about in which training programs do we have that people actually take and find useful. And this can be something like leadership capabilities, because I think it is a very important leadership capability to be able to support people who might approach you with, or if you witness as a leader. And this can be an informal kind of team lead, doesn't have to be department lead or anything like this. If you witness something, how do you act? So if there is kind of a leadership training that people usually take at the university to make this an important part of that, or if there is something around academic integrity and how we work with one another, it can become part of that as well. So I think it definitely makes sense to think about what are kind of the core competencies and knowledges and expertise that we expect of people within a university system, and where do we anchor this as important knowledge as well. Because what I often see when it is kind of its own kind of standing on its own program is that a lot of people say, yeah, of course, this is extremely important, but then they don't prioritize it enough to actually show up and do it. And I think we need to be a bit strategic about how we position that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see one data collection question and one specific case. I would like to ask the data collection question first and make sure that either we have enough time for the specific case afterwards, or maybe Bontu, if this is all right for you, that people could get in touch with questions that you might then answer via email, if that is okay for everyone, then I would like to ask this question first. I was wondering if you know of any good practice of systematically collecting data on cases of intersectional discrimination and potentially using it for pushing for internal policy slash transformation within universities, or any practices of how intersectionality can well be systematically coded or operationalized within university data collection processes more generally. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, very important, very difficult question. I was actually just discussing that the other day at a university I was working with. How do we do data collection intersectionally? Because the problem that we then often have is that numbers get quite small, because it is parts, fractions, specific groups that we're talking about. And then it becomes difficult to kind of, again, anonymize this data, use this data in a way that is not too obvious what and who we're talking about. And then the second point that I think it links to is how do we code it, or what are categories we use? And here maybe one project I can point to is the Adomus project. I can also maybe put it as a resource on at the end of the slides when I share them with you, Sarah. They're still in the process of working on it, but they've been looking at different methodological processes of understanding discrimination intersectionally at universities. They work here in Berlin at Humboldt University. And I've been following the research, and I'm very curious about what will come out of it in the next times, because they were working with a lot of experts across different intersections to really think about that questions of what categories can we use, how can we operationalize it, what can we ask people, how can we make sure that through this process of categorizing, we're not siloing. So I think that will be quite interesting, and I'll be happy to share that as a resource or as a project to follow.
That sounds very exciting. Thank you so much. That being said, I think we do have a couple of minutes left, so I would like to ask this last question in the chat, which is essentially about how one discrimination can be pitted against another and how to solve this issue when it comes up. Here, a participant asks, I'm not sure whether the concept of intersectionality can be fully applied, but it's a very concrete case, and they would really appreciate your feedback. Over the past couple of months, some university buildings have been undergoing renovation, which means that teams of construction workers have been working on a daily basis in the same spaces where we teach and where students access the library and common areas. Several incidents of harassment have been reported by female students. These include catcalling, explicit, vulgar forms of verbal harassment, etc., creating a climate of insecurity and toxicity on campus. When some students confronted the workers replied by accusing them of classism, claiming that it was easy for them as university students to make such accusations, minimizing the incidents, and even invoking their trade unions as a shield against allegations of misconduct. Given the situation, what kind of procedures should a university put in place to collect and address these reports properly, while also taking into account the workers' use of classism as a rhetorical alibi to deflect attention from the clearly sexist nature of the behavior? I think the participant already gave a really good analysis of that question, so provided the part of the answer at least. But I think it's a question that often comes up. What happens if one discrimination is like almost positioned to compete with another one, and how can you come up with a more holistic lens on this that takes it into account and is very specific about what exactly is going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to give a couple of pointers to it. One, I think, is this challenge we often have when we work with intersectionality about when is it an intersectional analysis, where we might ask this question of what else is at play here, and maybe next to the sexism, what else is at play here might be an issue of classism or other, there can be situations where something else is also at play. I was thinking about that when you talk about zero tolerance as well, that of course, if we say we have zero tolerance for any kind of discrimination, we might have situations where someone says, hey, this is sexist, and someone else says, well, the way that you're accusing me is racist, or, there can be these contradictions. So that sometimes it needs that extra perspective, and sometimes it goes into what sometimes we would call whataboutism. So kind of this thing of saying you're describing something that happens here, and then I say, yeah, but what about the fact that, you know, something else might also be going on? And I think as a first important step, it's always important to acknowledge that both of that can be true at the same time. And the additional point doesn't take away the validity of the first. So, just very briefly, I mean, I'm not super familiar with this case. I was just trying to listen along to what you were reading out. But even if, you know, we cannot assess, but if there is an issue of classism from students against how these workers were treated, that doesn't take away that there was an instance of sexism where someone had been catcalled. So one doesn't kind of even out the other. And I think that is often where these conflicts already start going wrong, that it sometimes becomes a competition of, but what was the more important one here? And to be able to hold this both and perspective, like both can be true at the same time and both need to be taken seriously. And a second thing, and I think this would need more time to do this in an in-depth analysis with this case, but in general, I think it is always important to think about what are the power perspectives here. Because one of the cases or some cases that I've come across in my work is then let's say a female PhD student reporting a supervisor of sexist harassment and maybe speaking publicly about this, and the supervisor then saying, "Now I actually feel attacked." That I'm being investigated and I'm not believed, etc. And there to really consider what is the power hierarchy here, and what are the responsibilities of the different people, and where is there maybe a certain weaponizing of discourses of I am also a victim here, etc. So I think in these cases we have to be careful that this is not used to weaponize those who are already in positions of power. But yes, then for this specific case, for sure, I would need a more detailed analysis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bontu. I think that was a really good one to both look at power positions and see where discrimination might be weaponized to cancel out a problem, and to be very careful when this is indeed what's going on and maybe not get tangled up in this attempt of drawing away attention. With that being said, I get a lot of praise in the chat, and we appreciate that very much. We would also like to ask you, since this is the case and you enjoy this, to give us some formal feedback. My colleague Marina is posting as I speak this survey in the chat. Please take a minute to fill it out so that we know just how much you enjoyed this and how much more of this work we can provide for you. It's been really great to be in conversation with you, to hear all of your exciting questions. Thank you so much, Bontu, for demonstrating your excellent work. I have read many a times that this was brilliant. I can only second that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the community of practice. This was really great fun and very instructive. And we'll see each other very soon for our quarterly meetings and Discord meetings. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you again from my side as well.
Thanks. See you.